Good evening to you, dear companion of quiet hours. Might I, with all the civility due from one of my station, request a small favor? If the tale that follows stirs your curiosity or grants you a moment's repose, do consider offering a modest, like, sharing this recital with others of refined taste, and subscribing to this humble channel of mine. It keeps the hearth warm and the lamp trimmed, as they say. Permit me a small curiosity. From which corner of the world do you listen? And what hour, bright or dim, finds you here with me? Whether it is the soft blush of morning or the velvet hush of midnight, I hope this story greets you gently and keeps good company in your solitude. I shall read this account slowly, with the care of one who remembers the weight of a well-turned phrase and the virtue of stillness. Do settle in perhaps with a cup of tea, or if the hour permits, a measured pour of brandy. Shall we, then, set the tale in motion? It was a brisk March evening in Boston, the sort that burned pink into one's cheeks, and insisted upon velvet-lined cloaks even for the shortest of walks. Gas lamps flickered low on Beacon Hill, their glow glancing off the polished boots of carriages lining Chestnut Street. Within the modest but meticulously kept Pendleton house, Seraphina was fastening a string of seed pearls at her throat, fingers steady despite the subtle flutter behind her ribs. The mirror before her, tall and foxed with age, caught her reflection, not quite clearly, but well enough. She was handsome in profile, a high brow, solemn gray eyes, and hair the color of roasted chestnuts, wound neatly at her nape. She looked, in her own estimation, like a woman being proposed to, or at the very least one being made the object of significant promises. "It suits you," said Sybil Rourke from the corner of the room, her voice muffled slightly by the pen she held between her teeth as she hemmed a stray thread on Sarah's sleeve. Though if he were truly clever, he'd have chosen garnets. "You wear shadows better than light." Sarah laughed a short, breathy thing, but did not reply. She had known Sybil long enough to recognize a compliment sharpened on wit. Downstairs, her father Oswald Pendleton cleared his throat loudly in the front hall, the sound echoing like a modest trumpet. "Carriage is outside, my girl, and the night won't get warmer." "Coming," she called, smoothing the skirts of her slate-blue gown. She'd chosen it deliberately, understated but expensive, the fabric holding a sheen like candlelight caught on water. Her gloves matched. Her shoes pinched slightly at the toes, but lent her the posture she required. As they descended the stairs, Sybil slipping out the side door to take the trolley and spare them gossip, Seraphine's mind returned, unbidden, to that familiar nausea she'd felt earlier that morning. It had come upon her with no breakfast, just the bitter scent of black tea and the echo of nerves. She had not told anyone, not yet. There were too many variables, too many possible outcomes. Tonight would determine the direction of them all. The Somerset Hotel was aglow by the time they arrived. Its columns were wreathed in electric bulbs, a modern conceit that Seraphina still found vaguely impersonal. Inside, gaslight still reigned, casting the entryway in a golden blur. The maître d' recognized the Pendleton name with a nod and led, then past rows of murmuring diners toward the private salon on the second floor, a room reserved for society's quieter scandals and more elegant celebrations. Quincy Thayer had arranged everything. His note, folded with mathematical precision, had arrived 3 days prior embossed, sealed, and tucked into a monogrammed envelope. A modest gathering, he'd written, for the occasion of your birth and the celebration of shared futures. Shared futures. It had been enough to send a warm pulse through her even then. Though Quincy rarely spoke plainly, when he did, he wielded charm like a scalpel, surgical and often cutting. Tonight she felt certain he would trade insinuation for commitment. The private room was already half full when she entered. Rosamond Shaw rose at once, brushing off invisible lint and offering a kiss that grazed only the air. "Darling Seraphina," she murmured, "how you glow. Truly, it's indecent." Sarah returned the courtesy, eyes flicking quickly to take stock of the rest. Rutherford Sloane was there, already halfway through his second glass of something amber and expensive. He looked up with a lazy grin and saluted her with his drink. Beside him sat Theodora Smythe and her perpetually silent husband, both dressed in the latest Parisian austerity. Others followed nearly, a dozen in all. Faces Seraphina had known since cotillion, since teas hosted by mothers, who passed judgment through their lorgnettes. Quincy stood at the far end, speaking in low tones with a man Sarah did not recognize, a younger man, handsome in a theatrical sort of way, whose shoes shone just a little too brightly. When Quincy turned and saw her, however, his expression softened into that smile she knew well, the kind that warmed only the surface, like sunlight on snow. "Miss Pendleton," he said, stepping forward and offering his hand. "You humble this room." She placed her gloved fingers in his. "Mr. Thayer," she replied with careful warmth, "the room, I think, is well practiced in pretense, but I am pleased to be here." He laughed, a low and pleasing sound. "Then we must begin. The kitchen grows anxious, and Rutherford grows drunk." She allowed him to guide her to the table, where name cards marked each guest's place. She was seated beside Quincy, naturally, and across from Rosamond, who seemed already bristling with the need to misinterpret something. As the first course was served an asparagus soup, laced with creme fraiche, and garnished with blood orange, zest Sarah inhaled carefully, and wondered in silence how long it would take him to present the ring. She suspected it would come between the roast and the tart, in that sweet spot when wine had relaxed everyone, but not yet loosened tongues. Quincy preferred control. He would want her smile timed precisely, her gratitude manageable. She could already see the announcement in the Globe, the statement from the Thayer firm, the whispers in drawing rooms from Concord to Cambridge. This was a life being arranged. Not asked for, but offered. Tonight would solidify it. And so when Quincy raised his glass and cleared his throat, the dining room fell effortlessly into silence, as though the moment had been rehearsed in advance. "Friends," he began, "and fellow believers in the future, let me say a word. Not about myself, though I am too often accused of that, but about a woman I have known these past 5 years." He turned to her. The candlelight danced in his eyes. "A woman whose dignity has humbled my ambitions, whose intellect has matched my own, and whose presence has made this city, my city, more tolerable. Miss Pendleton, I owe you more than a toast. I owe you thanks." The guests smiled. Rosamond dabbed at the corner of one eye. Rutherford raised an eyebrow and mouthed something obscene to his empty wine-glass. Quincy turned then and reached into the breast pocket of his dinner coat. He withdrew a small envelope cream, thick-papered, his monogram gleaming in gold. "For you," he said, "a small token, nothing vulgar, just a word of appreciation." He handed it to her, and for the briefest of moments, Seraphina believed the envelope held not words but a ring, a promise, a life. She did not yet know that it contained an execution. The envelope rested in Seraphine's hand like a pulsing thing, warm despite its dead weight. Her name, Seraphina Maud Pendleton, was written in Quincy's crisp script, the S ornamented just so, as though it might be the salutation on a wedding announcement rather than the beginning of a slow, silent upheaval. Quincy sat beside her, his elbow just grazing the silk of her sleeve, his posture impeccable. He raised his glass, and around the table, silverware stilled. A few guests, sensing theater, leaned forward as one might at a recital. "To Seraphina," Quincy said, voice low and deliberate, "a woman of quiet fortitude and astonishing patience, who has, for reasons I shall never understand, endured my lesser instincts and my political wanderings." There were soft chuckles, Rutherford louder than most. Even Sybil, from her position near the door in the guise of coat-check attendant, tilted her head slightly, suspicious. To her refinement, her loyalty, her, shall we say, gentle nature, a beat passed. "I hope tonight she will find this small gesture," he gestured toward the envelope, "worthy of her many years of company." Seraphina smiled, because not smiling would have been a greater scandal than weeping. The envelope trembled faintly in her grasp. Her thumb slid beneath the seal gold wax, marked with his family's crest, a lion rearing beside a pine. She opened it with the same care she might have given a prayer or a final will. Inside, one sheet of paper, thick, folded once. There were 12 lines. She would remember that later. 12. She read them twice. Then once more, not to confirm the content, no. The message was unmistakable, but to give her mind time to comprehend that the words were real, inked, signed, and final. "Seraphina, I regret the necessity of this method, but given your expectations and our current social entanglements, a public delivery is the clearest course. I am withdrawing from our arrangement. There is no future in it, no compatibility to justify prolonging our interactions. You are, by all accounts, decent. But I require more than decency. I am moving toward a political life that demands a different kind of partner. Please collect your things from my flat within the week. Do not write. Q." It took her 5 seconds to read. It would take 5 years to forget. She folded the letter neatly, tucked it back in the envelope. Silence had begun to gather, not sudden but creeping, like frost beneath a door. The candles flickered. The waitstaff, sensing something unnatural, paused just beyond the velvet partition. Only Rutherford Sloane, idiot or angel, cleared his throat and muttered, "Ah, so it's one of those evenings." Quincy was smiling, not broadly, but lightly, as though he had just delivered the punchline of an intellectual jest. He raised his glass again and murmured, "To necessary endings." Rosamond gasped. Someone else whispered he didn't, and another guest hushed them with a sharp hiss. Seraphina looked across the table. No one met her gaze except Theodore Smythe, who looked at her with something that might have been pity or confusion. She couldn't tell. Her eyes returned to Quincy, who was already turning to his plate, satisfied. She realized then that this had not been impulsive. It had been composed, rehearsed this entire evening, shaped like a stage, with Seraphina as both audience and fool. She thought of her morning sickness, of the letter's cold logic, of the years she had spent managing his moods, editing his essays, enduring his mother's disdain. She looked down at her gloves, noticed her knuckles had whitened beneath them, and then she smiled. A quiet, deliberate, terrifying smile. The clatter of cutlery resumed only because no one knew what else to do. Conversation did not recover. It limped on, gutted and faltering. Rutherford, too far in his cups to appreciate the shift in atmosphere, launched into a joke about a Lithuanian violinist and a bishop, which earned him nothing but a daggered look from Rosamund Shaw. Serafina remained motionless. Her hands rested, folded, atop the envelope like a funeral lily laid over the deceased. The soft murmurs, the scraping of forks, the murmured apologies from the waitstaff, all of it blurred into the gentle roar that fills the ears of a drowning woman just before surrender. But Serafina Pendleton did not drown. She turned slightly, just enough to face Quincy. "I must thank you," she said. The words were even, polite, and controlled. Her voice, long trained to carry in salons and galleries without ever rising in pitch, floated easily across the damask tablecloth. Her calmness unnerved more than any tears might have. Quincy's brows rose in faint surprise. "For what?" he asked. She met his eyes without blinking. "For your clarity. So many men prefer obfuscation. I'm grateful for the precision." He blinked once. Well, I did believe it best to avoid ambiguity." "You succeeded," she said. She reached for her wine-glass watered-down claret, hardly touched, and raised it, barely. "To necessary endings, as you said. May yours be swift." Then she drank, one sip, deliberate, and rose from her chair with a grace that sent a collective intake of breath through the guests. Rosamund half stood. "Serafina, dearest," surely Sarah waved her off with a flick of her fingers. Not rude, but final. To Quincy she offered a half-curtsy. "Please do remember to have your valet label my books separately. They are annotated." Quincy opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself, perhaps to deflect. She did not wait. She turned, stepped back from the table, and moved toward the door. Her spine remained perfectly straight, the pearls at her neck motionless despite the pounding of her heart. The room watched her as though she were a ship cutting through fog, unsure whether she would reach shore or sink in style. Outside the room she nodded to Sybil Rourke, who had silently slipped in with her wrap. "All ready?" Sybil asked, a warning tucked in her tone. "Yes," Sarah replied, voice steady. "Mr. Thayer and I have concluded our arrangements." Sybil's mouth tightened. He said something vile. He said something final. Sarah took the wrap, pulled it tightly around her shoulders. They descended the hotel staircase with decorum, and only once they reached the tiled vestibule did Serafina pause. "I believe," she said calmly, "that I am no longer engaged to Quincy Thayer." Sybil nodded. "Then let us call that a mercy." And together they stepped into the night where the carriages still waited, where the lamplight still flickered, and where, high above them, the society they had just abandoned quietly recalibrated its opinion of a woman who did not cry. The carriage ride home was silent, save for the rhythmic clatter of wheels over cobblestone and the soft creak of leather upholstery. Serafina sat opposite Sybil, her gloved hands neatly folded atop her lap, posture as perfect as it had been at the dinner table, only now she felt as though she were balancing porcelain upon her collarbone. One sudden motion, and everything might shatter. Sybil, seated slightly forward, had the expression of a woman calculating the damage behind a shuttered door. "You'll want to burn that letter," she said eventually, "or frame it. Depends on your mood." Serafina didn't answer. Her gaze remained fixed on the dark city, slipping past the carriage window rows of shuttered windows, iron railings slick with rain, gas lamps glowing like watchful eyes. Boston was always awake, even when asleep. The nausea returned, not a wave, but a whisper, and she pressed her fingers lightly to her stomach. No bump yet. No obvious sign, but it was there. A second heartbeat, somewhere beneath her own. "I suppose I ought to be grateful," she murmured. "For what, exactly?" Sybil's brows arched. "For the timing," Serafina replied. "Had he waited another fortnight, I might have delivered my news in return." That silenced Sybil for a moment. "Then you were going to tell him?" "Eventually," Sera said. "I thought it prudent." Civilized. Foolish, I see now. The nausea crept higher. She inhaled carefully through her nose and closed her eyes for a moment. The carriage rocked gently as they turned down Chestnut Street. "He planned that, didn't he?" she said softly. Sybil's response was immediate. Every word, every blink. "And the letter? Pre-written. Folded days ago, I'd wager. He probably had the valet iron the envelope." Serafina allowed herself a single, bitter laugh. "He wanted to shame me." "That was the point." "Yes," Sybil agreed. "And he failed." They arrived moments later at the Pendleton home, and Oswald met them at the door, in his dressing gown, a pipe in hand. His expression flickered with alarm when he saw his daughter's face, but she simply said, "We left before dessert." Inside, she retreated to her room, declined tea, and sat at her vanity in the half-dark. The letter lay before her again, opened and uncreased. She read it once more slowly, this time seeking a line, a phrase, anything that could be misread or soft. There was nothing, just Quincy's elegance wrapped around cruelty, like a ribbon on a blade. Her hands trembled. She looked at herself in the mirror, saw not tears, but pallor, resolve, and something else, a deep and dangerous quiet. She opened a drawer, placed a letter inside, and then, after a moment's pause, reached beneath the vanity and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, a note from her physician, a sealed envelope with her test results, and the schedule of prenatal visits for the month to come. She stared at them, then whispered, not to herself, but to something smaller than herself. "Well, my darling, it seems your father has chosen indifference, but we are not finished." Then she extinguished the lamp, drew the curtains against Beacon Hill's gaslight haze, and lay down on her bed, fully dressed. Outside, in drawing rooms and over telephones, the incident would be discussed in envelope, a smile, a scandal made of silence. But inside the Pendleton home, behind the last closed door, a woman plotted not vengeance but preservation. And the ruins Quincy Thayer had imagined would bury her? They were merely the first stones in a stronger foundation. The morning came gray and windless, a sky the color of tarnished silver, pressing down on Boston like the lid of a jewelry box. Chestnut Street was quiet at first, save for the occasional clatter of hooves and the scratch of a broom against brick. But within the sitting rooms and parlors of the Beacon Hill elite, conversation had already begun to flicker like lit match heads passed behind fans. Serafina Pendleton rose at her usual hour, lit the fire herself, something the help would normally do. But she felt the need to strike the match and dressed in a pale wool morning gown, with no adornment save a mother-of-pearl pin. She looked, in the words of one curious passer-by, who glimpsed her through the parlor window, precisely like a woman who has survived something quietly ruinous. In the dining room, the tea was waiting. apricot with a touch of almond, left beside a warmed pot by the maid who had wisely chosen not to loiter. The morning paper was folded next to it, and Seraphina, taking a seat by the eastern window, opened it with one hand while sipping from her cup with the other. There it was, halfway down the column in the Boston Morning Post's People and Peculiarities section, an article titled "Birthday Ball, Broken Bonds." A small dinner at the Somerset Hotel turned unexpectedly somber Saturday evening as a notable Beacon Hill match came to an abrupt and unexpected end. The gentleman, a rising councilman and celebrated legal mind, is rumored to have delivered his farewell in writing. The lady, an alumna of Radcliffe and known for her reserved intellect, departed with the sort of dignity that tends to make future wives very nervous indeed. Seraphina let the paper fall slightly, a small huff escaping her. There it was, the tidy summary of her life's unraveling, reduced to gossip-line calligraphy and veiled euphemisms. Future wives very nervous, indeed. She turned the page, found nothing more on the matter, and placed the paper aside. Then she sat in silence, letting the apricot tea coat her tongue, and her thoughts arranged themselves like soldiers in formation. Oswald Pendleton entered 15 minutes later, already dressed for his morning walk, dark coat, gloves in one hand, cane in the other. He did not greet her immediately. Instead, he crossed to the window, observed the street below for a long moment, then turned. "You'll be receiving callers today," he said quietly. "I imagined so." He laid his gloves on the corner of the table, an action she recognized from her childhood as his silent expression of disapproval. Her father never shouted. He simply placed his gloves down when something or someone deserved correction. "You could have informed me." "I didn't have the time," she said evenly. "Had I known, I'd have declined the invitation myself." "You did nothing wrong," she replied. "He did." Oswald nodded once, slowly. He looked as though he wanted to say more, but he did not. Instead, he moved to the foyer. Just before the door closed behind him, he added without turning, "Your mother would have said, 'Light a lamp before the night gets darker.' I suggest you consider it." The door clicked shut, and she was alone again. Seraphina let the moment pass. Then she rose, folded the paper precisely, and carried it to the hearth. She knelt and fed it into the flames, not hurriedly, but deliberately. The ink browned, the gossip curled, and then, as the first embers rose into the chimney, she spoke aloud, not to herself, but to the space where her future used to live. "I am lighting the lamp now, Mother, and I assure you the night will see me clearly." The Rourke sewing shop was tucked above a cobbler's storefront on Tremont Street, its narrow stairs creaking like old bones as Seraphina climbed. Outside, Boston bustled with early spring business paper boys shouting headlines, trolleyed bells chiming down the brick-sloped streets, but within Sybil's workspace, time bent its head and stitched quietly forward. The shop smelled of starch, beeswax, lavender soap, and something faintly singed, likely muslin left too long under the iron. Bolts of fabric leaned against the wall like bored patrons at a theater intermission, and on the center table a navy gabardine coat lay half-finished, pins gleaming like tiny sabers. Sybil stood behind it, her spectacles perched low on her nose, brown hair tied back in a kerchief with no particular artifice. She looked up as Seraphina entered, but said nothing until the door latched behind her. "Well," she muttered, threading a needle with unnecessary force, "you're either here to give me a shopping list, or to collapse. I've got brandy for the first and peppermint tea for the second. Serafina closed her gloves slowly, one finger at a time. I need the tea. Sybil didn't blink. Then sit. Kettle's warm. She crossed the room, brushing aside a paper pattern of a military frock coat as she passed. Serafina sat on the stool near the window, where the light was best for handwork and confession alike. When Sybil returned with the tea poured into 2 unmatched porcelain cups from a cracked teapot, Serafina accepted it with both hands. Her gloves lay folded neatly in her lap. I'm pregnant, she said without preamble. Sybil paused just long enough to prove it was not entirely a surprise. She blew on her tea, then sipped. And he knows? No. Good. Serafina looked up. Sybil added, because if he knew and still did what he did delivered that letter in front of Rosamond, Shaw's beady little eyes, then we'd be having a very different conversation, involving arsenic and a spoon. Despite herself, Serafina let out a soft laugh. Sybil leaned forward, resting her elbows on the cutting table. How far? 2 months, nearly. You certain? Dr. Rothwell confirmed it last Tuesday. I asked for a false name at the desk. Good girl. Sybil's mouth pressed into a line. You going to keep it? I'm going to raise it, Sira said, her voice steady. Not merely keep it. And I will not let him use this child as leverage for redemption. Sybil nodded slowly. You have plans. I will, Sara replied. I need time and money. And I need a way to stay above the ruin Quincy believes he left me in. Sybil stood, crossed the room. She opened a narrow drawer in her sewing table and pulled out a folded envelope, sealed with wax not gold but blue. She handed it to Serafina. What is this? 10 years of rainy day coin. And before you say anything noble or self-sacrificing, let me be plain. If you don't use it, I will spend it on buying a monkey, naming it Quincy, and teaching it to fling manure at the State House. Serafina stared at the envelope. Sybil said softly, You may have been unchosen, Sarah, but you are not unworthy. Don't let him make you think otherwise. Serafina felt the breath catch just slightly in her throat. There, between 2 unfinished coats and the scent of singed cotton, she allowed herself to be silent, not broken, not victorious, but simply seen. The wind had changed direction by late afternoon, sweeping in from the Charles and ruffling the lace curtains in the Pendleton study. It carried with it the scent of river rot and brick familiar, unlovely, honest. Serafina stood before the hearth, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a small brass poker in one hand and a stack of letters in the other. The fire was newly built, pine and birch, quick to catch, ideal for burning history. The letters were bundled in Twine Quincy's courtship, written in ink so precise it seemed mechanical, like something etched by law clerks rather than lovers. Most were brief, some poetic. One had once made her cry. She couldn't remember which. She pulled the first from the stack. Sarah, your voice in the hallway echoes in my mind like an epigraph I've not yet deciphered. She snorted. Into the fire it went. The second. I think of you whenever I pass the State House, which is daily, which means I am beset by longing. Another eye roll, another crumple, another brief flare of ash and smoke. She fed the letters to the flames slowly, one by one, not with fury, but with formality, a ceremony, a laying to rest. Not all were unkind. Some spoke of future summers in Maine, a cottage they would never buy, children they would never name. She burned those too. By the time the last letter caught flame, her study smelled of scorched wax and cedar. Her dress carried smoke like a veil. Her face was still. When Oswald knocked on the door, she called without turning, "I'm busy, Father." A pause, then the shuffle of retreating footsteps. She watched the last of the paper curl into nothing. The fire hissed its final whisper. Then she bent, adjusted a coal with the poker, and stood again. Her hand moved to her stomach, resting there lightly. "That's all of him," she whispered. "Now we build something else." And the quiet, the fire agreed. Rosamond Shaw's garden was the sort of place where reputations wilted faster than roses. Trimmed hedges, iron benches, and ivy climbing up trellised brick made it seem to the untrained eye a haven of gentility. But for those raised on Boston's social circuit, it was a battlefield where smiles were weapons and teacups trembled with venom. Serafina arrived precisely 10 minutes late, as etiquette demanded of a woman whose dignity had recently been called into question. Not so late as to appear flustered, not so early as to seem desperate. She wore dove-gray silk with a white sash at the waist and gloves dyed to match. Her hat was modest, a soft brim angled just enough to shadow her eyes. Rosamond greeted her with the warmth of a hearth that's gone cold. "Serafina, my dear," she cooed, pressing air kisses to either cheek. "You look resilient." "I suppose I've had practice," Serafina replied. The other women were gathered in clusters near the rose trellises, speaking softly in clumps, each pretending not to notice her, each clocking every movement she made. Cups clinked. Fans fluttered. The script was being revised in real time. Serafina took her tea without milk, no sugar, and seated herself beside Theodora Smythe, whose attempt at a greeting resembled the blink of an owl in daylight. The silence swelled. It was Rosamond, of course, who broke it. "My husband was saying only last night's scandal is like wind. It rushes in, makes the curtains billow, and then finds a new window. Isn't that so, dear?" She offered Serafina a too-sweet smile. "You've weathered the breeze admirably." Serafina stirred her tea once. "Precisely. Tell your husband I've always preferred a draught to suffocation." There were a few muffled coughs. One woman dropped her spoon. Rosamond's smile twitched, just once. "It's good to see you, Sarah, truly. I worried you might retreat." "Retreat?" Serafina sipped. "No, I find my appetite for society is evolving." Across the table, Rutherford Sloane arrived late and out of breath, uninvited as always. He plucked a macaron from the silver tray and murmured, "God help us all. There's a new Southern girl about." Seraphine's eyes flicked toward him. "Pardon?" "Tallulah," Rutherford said, mouth half full. "Tallulah Shaw, cousin of Rosamond's, fresh from Charleston. Glows like a lantern and speaks like magnolia honey. Quincy's been sniffing round her like a hound." Rosamond did not deny it. In fact, she looked pleased. "She's quite the charm," she said lightly, "and very pliant." Serafina placed her teacup down with audible care. "Then I do hope he finds her company more enduring than mine." The words hung for a moment, then settled like lead in crystal. Rutherford, unrepentant, lifted his glass and muttered, "To pliant futures." A few guests chuckled uneasily. Serafina smiled, but her eyes did not, and as she rose to leave, hat adjusted and gloves refastened, she offered Rosamond a final glance. "Thank you for the tea," she said. "It's always instructive to see what grows in your garden." She departed with her chin high and her pace unhurried, leaving behind more than gossip. She left a mark. and in every glance exchanged behind her back she knew they feared her now, not for her scandal, but for her survival. The law offices of Thayer and Rowe sat just off Pemberton Square, a Georgian brick structure with ivy trained to look accidental. From the outside it was indistinguishable from the dozen other respectable establishments lining the block, but within it housed the trappings of a man building not only a career, but a legacy, Quincy's legacy. A legacy Seraphina Pendleton intended to examine with a scalpel. She arrived at 3:15, escorted by a discreet cab rather than a family carriage. Her dress was unadorned dove wool, her gloves soft gray. Nothing about her suggested drama. She moved like a woman attending to dull errands, library returns, perhaps, or a mild dispute about billing. The receptionist, a sharp-chinned girl with a forgettable voice, recognized her immediately and offered the practiced smile of someone who knew better than to ask questions. "Mr. Thayer is in court," she said. "As expected," Seraphina replied. "I've come only for my personal effects." He mentioned a folder I'd left in the writing drawer. The receptionist nodded, clearly told not to interfere. "You know the way, Miss Pendleton?" Indeed she did. The walk down the narrow corridor to Quincy's office was brief but potent, like stepping back into a house whose rooms you once painted but no longer own. The scent of aged paper, mahogany polish, and Quincy's preferred bay rum cologne still lingered faintly in the air. Her heels tapped softly against the parquet. Inside, the office was just as she remembered. Austere, meticulous, curated for visitors who valued discipline over warmth. The curtains drawn half shut, the desk cleared save for a silver inkwell blotter and perfectly squared stack of correspondence. She closed the door behind her. Only then did she let the mask slip just a notch. She moved quickly. Sybil's locksmith contact, an odd young man named Tobias, with a fondness for Latin proverbs, had provided her with a false key. She slipped it from her handbag, approached the desk, and knelt beside the middle drawer. Click. It opened without protest. Inside, a ledger bound in navy cloth, marked only with the year. She pulled it out, flipped through. Dates, figures, donor names. Then strange inconsistencies, contributions logged twice, once at one amount and again at another. Withdrawals that were rounded, frequent, unauthorized. She opened the next drawer. Receipts, dozens of them, folded neatly in ascending date order. One from Lemaire's jewelers, $210 for a sapphire pendant. One from Delacourt House, a private supper club, $78 for a dinner for two. One from a hotel in New Hampshire, far from any campaign trail. All within the past 4 months. She scanned the handwriting. The initials appeared repeatedly, Thais, Tallulah, Shaw. Seraphina allowed herself one single breath of vindication. Then she withdrew the small camera from her handbag, a cumbersome, palm-sized contraption that Sybil's tenant had lent in exchange for 3 tailored waistcoats. Sera had practiced its use the previous night under candlelight, and now she worked methodically, hands steady, capturing each damning page. Tick, snap. Tick, snap. She moved like a surgeon, no hesitation, no flair, just quiet accuracy. The final drawer revealed a single letter, handwritten on stationery unfamiliar to her. It was addressed not to a donor, nor to Tallulah, but to someone named R.C., a political handler, she guessed. I cannot move forward under Seraphine's ever-watchful gaze. Her disapproval colors everything. She cannot be relied upon to endorse what she does not morally approve. I need someone simpler, decorative, deferential. This election must be about optics, not obstacles. She read it twice, then folded it back and slipped it into her coat. The camera back in her bag, the drawers locked again, the envelope she had come to retrieve in her hand. Serafina cast one final glance around the room. The fire in her belly was no longer morning sickness. It was strategy, and she was just getting started. The back room of Sybil's shop had been many things, a sleeping quarters, a fitting room, once even a temporary nursery for her cousin's illegitimate child. But tonight it served its highest function, a war room. The windows were shuttered. The gas lights burned low. The table, cleared of bodices and fabric bolts, was now strewn with photographs, ledgers, and the stale smell of adrenaline masked beneath lavender water. Serafina stood over the table like a general reviewing enemy lines. Sybil leaned over the opposite end, sleeves rolled and spectacles perched dangerously low. A pot of tea, long forgotten, sat cooling between them. "Lord," Sybil murmured, flipping one of the photographs. "He didn't just cross lines. He threw a bloody parade over them." Serafina nodded, gaze locked on the document where Quincy had listed a $500 Community Development Fund transfer, redirected instead to executive hospitality, the polite euphemism for cigars, women, and private dinners for men with too much power and too few witnesses. "Here," Sybil tapped a receipt. "Delacourt House. That's the one where councilmen pretend they still live in the Gilded Age." Serafina followed the dates. The pattern was clear. Each political fundraiser corresponded with a secondary charge, always entertainment, always luxury, and always hidden under generic line items. She slid another photo into view. "This one," she said quietly. "He signed it himself. No assistant scrawl." Sybil examined it. "That's jailbait if it lands in the right hands." Serafina shook her head. "Not yet. I'm not interested in scandal for sport. I want leverage." "To what end?" Sybil asked, brows lifting. "Security, custody, and space to live my life without fearing another ambush in a dining room." Sybil stared at her a moment longer, then reached under the table and produced a tin biscuit box. "Here," she said, opening it. Inside lay rolls of film, gently wrapped in muslin. "I'll develop them through Tobias. He's discreet and hopelessly in love with me." Sarah allowed herself the ghost of a smile. "You're certain he won't talk?" "He's a second-year seminary student with a love of photography and absolutely no skill with women. If he breathes a word of this, I'll tell his mother he's taken up nude life drawing. He'll vanish." Serafina reached for her tea, now cold, and sipped anyway. "This," she said, gesturing to the table, "is who Quincy really is. Not the man who quoted Emerson or praised my Latin. This, receipts and hush money and substitutions." Sybil nodded slowly. "You don't want revenge, do you?" Sarah met her eyes. "No, I want freedom and proof." A silence settled over them. Not the heavy kind, but the still one that comes after truth is spoken aloud. For the first time in weeks, Serafina exhaled without hesitation. And in the glow of the gaslight over photos and financial crimes, she realized that Quincy Thayer hadn't broken her. He had simply revealed the blueprints. And now she would build. The Pendleton study had always been a room of restraint. The bookshelves rose like stoic sentinels, filled with maritime logs and volumes of Cicero. The armchairs were firm, the wallpaper unyielding in its beige dignity. It was not a place where emotions were entertained, let alone indulged. And yet, that evening, Seraphina sat curled in her father's warm reading chair, bare feet tucked beneath her, a wool shawl draped over her shoulders, as she flipped slowly through the copy of Quincy's letter she'd taken. She had read it already once in Siebel's shop, again on the ride home, but now she read it differently, not for facts but for temperature, not for content but for character. I cannot move forward under Seraphine's ever-watchful gaze. She read the line again, mouth curling faintly, not in amusement but in recognition. Quincy hadn't merely grown tired of her. He had feared her, not for what she might do, but for what she might prevent. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a mirror with no opinions. He wanted applause, not analysis, a decorative witness. She turned the page. This election must be about optics, not obstacles. There it was, in plain script proof not just of betrayal, but of intention. Her morality, her caution, her insight, they weren't flaws. They were threats. To Quincy, they had made her expendable. She set the letter down carefully, not crumpled or burned this time, but folded once, and placed beside her like a reference book. Her hand moved to her abdomen, instinctive now. Still no movement, no flutter. Just the deep knowing that her body was no longer her own, and yet in every way that mattered, more hers than ever before. She thought of the child within, the son or daughter who would someday ask questions about love, about power, about dignity, and she would have answers. She reached for a small notebook on the table, her father's old logbook from his days at sea. On a blank page near the middle, she began to write, "Observations on character, Quincy Thayer." She listed his traits like a naturalist might catalog a snake. Charismatic under pressure, prone to cruelty, masked as charm. Pathologically self-serving values legacy. Over honesty. Underestimates women who do not yell. When she finished, she set the book down and looked out the window. The Beacon Hill lamps still burned, as they always had, but she saw them differently, now not as distant stars, but as torches. And Seraphina Pendleton had learned how to walk toward fire without flinching. The ballroom at the Hawthorne Club was thick with music, mirrors, and the kind of laughter one only heard when people were deeply uncomfortable and deeply determined not to show it. The chandeliers threw fractured light across velvet gowns and polished shoes. Champagne flutes chimed like distant bells. And in the center of it all, like a perfectly composed tableau, stood Quincy Thayer. On his arm was a woman none of them had seen until recently, Tallulah Shaw, a debutante from Charleston with butter-yellow curls and a voice like syrup poured too slow. She wore rose chiffon that sparkled just enough, smiled just enough, and said nothing of consequence, just enough. Seraphina stood near the refreshment table, untouched punch in hand, watching. She had expected this. It was the final act in Quincy's theater of damage control. Public display of replacement, complete with soft lighting, thin flattery, and a narrative of cheerful reinvention. "I see he's upgraded," Rutherford Sloane murmured at her elbow, nursing what appeared to be straight brandy in a teacup. Lighter hair, fewer opinions. "Easier to pose beside," Seraphina replied, not looking at him. "Decorative, obedient, the perfect campaign poster." Seraphina took a small sip, more for show than hydration. He won't marry her, not yet. He needs her as metaphor, not as wife. Rutherford blinked. "Good God, Sarah, that's cold." She smiled faintly. "It's accurate." They watched as Quincy guided Tallulah through the crowd, offering nods, tight smiles, phrases just loud enough to be overheard. ... So charming, from such good people. No scandal there. When his eyes met Seraphine's across the ballroom, something flickered. Was it triumph, challenge, or perhaps just the panic of a man who knows the knife he used may still be in the room? She inclined her head politely, the gesture of a woman who had not merely survived, but catalogued his sins in triplicate. Rutherford nudged her gently. "You do realize," he murmured, "that you've become terribly interesting since the disaster." "Not interesting," she corrected. "Dangerous." He lifted his cup. "To danger." She clinked her glass lightly against his. Quincy looked away first, and Tallulah, radiant and pliant in her borrowed city, never noticed. The office of Miss Octavia Thatcher was hidden above a tobacconist's shop on Bowdoin Street, a location carefully chosen, Seraphina suspected, for its invisibility rather than its convenience. There was no nameplate on the stairwell, only the faint scent of pipe smoke clinging to the banister, and a single buzzer at the top marked OT. Seraphina pressed it. A long pause, then a click. The door swung inward to reveal a small antechamber crowded with books, dusty curtains, and what looked like a sleeping cat occupying the entire cushion of an armchair. From behind a folding screen, a voice called, "You're on time. You may enter. If you are here to inquire about libel, I don't do theatrical revenge." "I'm not," Seraphina replied, stepping inside. The woman who emerged from behind the screen looked like she'd stepped from a law journal and into the 20th century by accident. Mid-40s, tall, wiry, and dressed in a charcoal dress with a double collar and no ornamentation. Her hair was pinned without vanity, her spectacles perched precisely halfway down her nose. "Miss Pendleton," she said, extending a hand as though to shake a fact, not a person, "I was told you were intelligent." "I do hope that holds." "I hope so too," Seraphina replied, taking the seat offered. Octavia sat opposite her and poured 2 cups of tea, no sugar, no cream. "I assume you're here about Mr. Quincy Thayer. If not, we've both wasted a perfectly good morning." "I am," Sera said, accepting the tea. "Good, I despise surprises." Octavia sipped and continued. "What do you want? Be specific. If it's public ruination, that's an expensive game with little payoff. If it's security, we may proceed." Seraphina hesitated only long enough to make it deliberate. "I want the truth recorded, his misconduct checked, and a legal shield to protect my child." Quietly. Octavia blinked once. "You're pregnant?" "Yes. Then time matters. You have approximately 4 months before the bump betrays you. 6 if you wear cloaks and lie well." Seraphina nodded. "He doesn't know." Octavia made a small note in a narrow ledger. "He will. Eventually. Men like him have a scent for inconvenience. Let's get ahead of that." She reached behind her and pulled down a file folder. It was empty, but waiting. "You will write everything. In order, names, dates, receipts, witnesses. Emotion is fine, but I will translate it into admissible narrative." Seraphina sipped her tea. "And the financial side? If he is as careless as your letter suggested, we can argue for breach of informal contract engagement with economic dependency. It's a shaky precedent, but the newspapers are your ally. He doesn't want headlines." Sera's eyes flicked up. "And if he tries to smear me?" Octavia smiled faintly. "Then we publish." There was silence between them, not awkward but charged. Two minds in agreement, aligned not by affection, but by purpose. Finally, Octavia leaned forward. Miss Pendleton, the most valuable thing a woman can own in this city is not beauty, not lineage. It's documentation. Shall we begin? Serafina reached into her satchel, withdrew the photos, the receipts, and the copied letter. Let's, she said. The draft took shape like a needlepoint under practiced hands, painstaking, methodical, each stitch precise. Over the next several days, Serafina met with Miss Octavia Thatcher in that cramped office above the tobacconist, each session unfolding more of her story and laying its contents bare beneath the cold light of legality. Octavia wrote in sharp, slanting script with a fountain pen that never blotted. Her language was not sentimental, nor even theatrical, but surgical. Documented abandonment of engagement, concurrent evidence of infidelity, and misappropriation of political funds relevant to ongoing campaign activity. Client seeks limited, non-public settlement to secure prenatal support, future custodial assurances, and silence on both sides. Serafina watched each clause form with a kind of distant awe. It was the language of contracts, not romance, the complete inverse of the letters Quincy had once written to her, those flourished declarations now reduced to financial footnotes and cause for precaution. "This won't destroy him," Octavia remarked one afternoon as she flipped a page and blotted the ink carefully. "But it will make him deeply uncomfortable. That's all I require." "Do not expect contrition," the solicitor added, not unkindly. "He will see this as attack, not negotiation. Men of his type call it blackmail when you simply ask for what they fear." Serafina nodded. "I don't need his guilt, just his cooperation." Octavia handed her a carbon copy to review. "Your requests are modest. Financial support through childbirth. Custody default to you unless proven otherwise. A promise not to interfere with naming, raising, or pressuring the child. You've left out vengeance." "I've no use for vengeance," Serafina replied. "It feeds no one." Octavia paused. "You're more dangerous than you appear, Miss Pendleton." "Thank you," Sarah said softly. They reviewed the rest of the document. At no point did Serafina cry, pause, or hesitate. It wasn't coldness, it was preparation. If she was to build a new life, it had to begin in ink and intention. When the draft was complete, Octavia folded it crisply and sealed it with a plain wax stamp, no sigil, no crest, only initials. O.T. "I'll send it to his private address," she said. "No office. No fanfare. Let him receive it in silence as you did his." Serafina stood, adjusted her gloves. "Let him read it where he thinks no one is watching." Exactly. As she stepped into the hallway and descended the narrow stairs into the smoke-scented world below, Serafina felt no triumph, only clarity. Her war was not waged with sabers, nor with scenes. It was waged in quiet rooms, with paper, and the battle had just begun. That evening, long after her father had retired to his study and the city's carriages had thinned to near silence, Serafina sat at her writing desk with only a candle, a fountain pen, and a ledger older than she was. She had pulled it from the Pendleton attic earlier that day, a blank account book Oswald once used to track shipping manifests. The cover was worn, but the pages were thick, the binding honest. It felt appropriate. This, after all, was not a diary. It was a record, a reconstruction, her own ledger of things taken and things owed. On the first page she wrote, For the record of Miss Seraphina M. Pendleton, against the gentleman Quincy J. Thayer, E.S.Q. Then she began, not a letter, not an elegy, an inventory. March 14th, 1906. Advised not to speak during Quincy's fundraising dinner at the Union Club, was introduced as a charming companion if unopinionated, smiled politely, did not eat dessert. April 2nd, 1906. Asked to sign off on campaign expense summary. Refused. Noted discrepancies. Quincy reacted coldly. Called me obsessive. Did not bring it up again. May 9th, 1906. Discussed possibility of marriage. He deferred, said his timing must serve the party first. Suggested I manage expectations. June 27th, 1906. Was denied access to our shared account for flat expenses. Quincy claimed too many cooks. Later discovered he'd used funds for Delacourt House subscription. Her handwriting remained even. Her tone was factual. She omitted nothing, embellished nothing. The page bore witness to the slow erosion of dignity under the disguise of civility. Later entries grew more intimate, not emotionally, but contextually. October 3rd, 1906. Doctor confirmed pregnancy. Initial suspicion stemmed from consistent nausea. Had not informed Quincy. Feared interpretation as tactic. October 6th, 1906. Quincy returned late. Smelled of expensive cologne, not his own. No apology. Left immediately for Providence with no stated business. She paused, rubbed her temples. It was exhausting, this translation of pain into evidence, but it was necessary. If he struck first, she needed more than sentiment. She needed facts, paper, pattern. So she wrote on, each word a brick, each entry a beam. Each line a boundary drawn around the life she would not surrender. The draft reached Quincy Thayer's private residence on a Thursday morning, hand-delivered by a boy too young to ask questions and too well-paid to linger. It was addressed in Octavia Thatcher's elegant script, clean, sparse, unmistakably legal. There was no reply. Not that day. Not the next. Seraphina waited. She did not pace. She did not flinch. Instead, she polished the brass drawer pulls in the hallway. She clipped the dried rose heads from the garden. She rewrote a long overdue note to her cousin Theodosia in Hartford. She refused to let her father or Sybil see her glance at the clock, but she did glance, often. On Sunday, during service at King's Chapel, she heard it two women behind her murmuring just softly enough to be heard, just loudly enough to be intentional. They say she sent him something, not flowers, not forgiveness. No, not a letter, something with weight to it. Signed by a woman, a lady solicitor imagine, with a name like Thatcher, no less. Seraphina did not turn. She simply held her chin higher and listened until they fell quiet. On Monday, Oswald entered the breakfast room carrying a copy of the Boston Herald, folded to a minor column on page 3. He laid it beside her plate without comment. His gloves were already on. The headline read, Councilman Thayer, under scrutiny. Discrepancies in campaign filing draw private inquiry. The article made no mention of Seraphina, no mention of women at all, but she saw the cracks forming. He was feeling it, the pressure, the shift. That evening Oswald finally spoke. You've made your move, he said from the armchair, his brandy untouched. Now hold your ground. Seraphina, seated near the fire, closed the ledger she'd been reviewing. I intend to. Outside, a breeze swept down the hill, scattering dried leaves like stray pages across the cobblestones. And within the Pendleton home, paper ruled the future, not promises, not sentiment, not lineage. Paper and patience. It was not a respectable hour when Rutherford Sloane knocked upon the Pendleton door. Past 11, perhaps midnight. The rain had turned the gas lamps into trembling ghosts, and his boots squelched on the sandstone as though embarrassed to tread so late. Seraphina had not yet retired. She sat in the front parlor, a copy of The Atlantic open in her lap, unread, when she heard the knock. Not the crisp rap of the postman or the urgent ring of a messenger boy, but a slow, uncertain thudding, as if the knocker itself were weary. Oswald reached the door before she did. He opened it with the caution of a man who'd once served in wartime, only to find a familiar face beneath a dripping hat. "Sloane?" he asked, startled. "I need a word with Miss Pendleton," Rutherford said, slurring only slightly. "A quiet one, and dry, if possible." Rain had darkened his greatcoat to black. His collar drooped like wilted parchment, and he clutched a flat, wrapped parcel under one arm, a letter. It seemed protected by oilskin, but no pretense. "Let him in," Seraphina said, appearing beside her father. "But no whiskey until I hear what this is." They settled him in the drawing-room, where the hearth still held a faint glow. Oswald left them, murmuring something about trusting her judgment more than the hour deserved. Sarah poured tea herself. Rutherford declined it with a wave and gestured toward the parcel. "You ought to see this," he said, "before he does worse." She peeled the oilskin back and withdrew a single page, thick and cream-colored, unmistakably Quincy's stationery. His handwriting curled across it like a snake. Sarah read silently, then again. Her fingers tightened. "He drafted this for a Mr. Howmond," Sloane said. "Head of campaign accounts. Meant to send it tomorrow. I borrowed it." The letter spoke of her as unstable, hysterical, unfit for public affiliation. It mentioned pregnancy only as rumor, one to be denied unless politically advantageous. She folded it with reverence, not anger. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked. Rutherford looked at her, rain still clinging to his lashes. "Because I may be a coward," he said, "but I'm not a bastard." And that, as far as midnight confessions go, was enough. By morning the letter had dried, but the venom within had not. Seraphina carried it in her handbag to Miss Thatcher's office, arriving precisely at 9, as fog still clung to the city, like morning lace. Octavia was waiting, as ever, with a steel pen and an expression of composed warfare. "This is a gift," she said, without looking up from the page. "A ghastly one, but a gift nonetheless." They read it together, word by word. The phrase "emotional irregularity" prompted a snort from Octavia. The mention of pregnancy as a rumor earned only a slow blink. "He plans to discredit you before you can be believed," she said. "Then we must make sure I'm heard before he speaks." Octavia opened a drawer and placed a letter inside a manila folder, already marked Thayer, dossier. It was not the first entry. She began drafting an addendum to Seraphine's legal claim, an amendment stating that should Quincy make any defamatory statements about Miss Pendleton in the public sphere regarding her mental state, reproductive status, or social decorum, then the full collection of documents would be released to the Boston Globe. "I assume you are still uninterested in full litigation?" Octavia asked. "Correct." but I want him to know how close he is to ruin. Then this is your canon." The final line Octavia added in her tight hand. "Client reserves right to disclose said material to protect reputation, livelihood, and future familial interests." It was no longer merely defense, it was deterrence. Serafina left the office lighter, not from relief, but readiness. Let Quincy speak. Let him sputter and spin. She now had the antidote in his own hand. Back at the Pendleton home, Serafina laid the damning letter on her writing desk, beside her ledger and a pot of inkwell gone crusted with disuse. She lit a new taper. There was no room for darkness tonight. She retrieved the Thayer folder from her bag and began inserting additional notes. Bank receipts, copies of campaign funds reallocated improperly, and now this new page of deliberate slander. Octavia had promised legal protection, but Sarah knew in Boston society reputation was armor. She needed more than defense. She needed witnesses. Her first note was addressed to the Reverend Thomas Sharp, a friend of her late uncle, and a man known to the old money said as both moral and discreet. He had once performed her confirmation. The second went to Miss Odessa Tilling Radcliffe, alumna, once courted by Quincy, and now running a literacy fund from Beacon Hill. Odessa knew how to play quiet chess in rooms full of egos. The third she debated, then dipped pen again. To Mr. Theodore Strathmore, "I trust you will forgive the informality of this invitation. I should like to discuss matters of mutual concern. You were recommended for your discretion, and I find myself in need of precisely that. Tomorrow at 3, the Pendleton parlor, should you be available." She sealed each envelope in wax. Not blood red, but blue, like dignity. Then she rang for Oswald. "3 deliveries," she said, "and no questions, please." He only nodded. There were moments when Oswald understood better than she did herself. As he left with the letters, Serafina stood at the window, watching dawn pierce the clouds over Commonwealth Avenue. The streets were slick with last night's sins. Let Quincy prepare his speeches. She was preparing her audience. The Pendleton parlor had not been this alive since her mother's final Christmas. Flowers had returned to the vases. Silver had been polished. A fire crackled not for warmth, but dignity. At precisely 3, the guests arrived. The Reverend Sharp came first, hat in hand, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. His eyes crinkled kindly. Next was Odessa Tilling. Her black gloves matched perfectly to her peacock blue walking suit. She kissed Sarah's cheek and said with a whisper, "At last, some proper drama." Then unfashionably punctual came Theodore Strathmore. He wore no overcoat, just a gray suit that had been brushed but not tailored, with shoes that looked polished despite their wear. He removed his hat as he entered, offering it to Oswald with a quiet "Thank you, sir," that won the butler's rare nod. Serafina waited until they had all accepted their tea before she stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture dramatically. She simply laid the letter on the tea tray. "Quincy Thayer intends to ruin me," she said. "With rumor, with slander, and with carefully seeded lies. I do not wish to sue him. I wish to outmaneuver him." They read the letter in order of seniority. First the Reverend, who paled visibly. Then Odessa, who laughed quiet, sharp, impressed. Finally Theodore, who read slowly twice. When he looked up, he said simply, "He's underestimated you." "That's his mistake." Serafina inclined her head. "I intend to make it his ruin." They drank their tea in silence after that. But in that parlor something had shifted. A conspiracy had begun not of malice, but of resolve. The Pendleton name would not fall quietly, and neither would she. It was while dusting her mother's armoire task she had long deferred that Seraphina found it. The armoire's false bottom, once concealed beneath folded linens, yielded to a gentle prod. Beneath, nestled in the velvet-lined hollow, lay a book-bound ledger no larger than a psalter, but far heavier in implication. The binding bore no name, just 3 faint letters embossed on the inside flap. PTF, Pendleton Trust Fund. She carried it downstairs like glass. On her writing desk, she opened the first page. Receipts, account entries, notations in a hand she did not recognize, but with amounts she very much did, and their entry after entry disbursements labeled innocuously, but tagged with companies she'd never heard of, shipping firms, print houses, a Wellington Press Limited, with no Boston listing. At the bottom of a March entry, a line caught her breath. Approved by QT. She closed the ledger and sat in stillness. So it had begun earlier than she thought. Not merely a private betrayal, but a theft, long before there was a wedding to cancel. When she looked up, her hands were steady, her breath slow. She rang for Oswald. "Please have Miss Thatcher summoned," she said, "and tell Mr. Strathmore I may need his eyes. He's good with columns." The battle had changed. Now it would be fought on numbers, and Quincy would not enjoy the arithmetic. The study smelled of ink, ash, and resolve. Theodore sat cross-legged at the end of the Pendleton desk, sleeves rolled, spectacles perched absurdly on the tip of his nose as he read aloud the names in the ledger. Darwin Freight, Langley and Sons, Wellington Press. Either he's publishing a secret newspaper, or none of these exist. "They don't," Octavia said, eyes fixed on her typewriter. "At least not in the Massachusetts Business Registry. I checked." "Shell companies," Seraphina murmured. "Quincy's always liked nesting things. Secrets inside secrets." Theodore grinned, not unkindly. "A shame he left a trail of breadcrumbs." The hours passed with little conversation. Octavia cross-checked dates against the Pendleton Trust's annual filings. Theodore drew lines between entries, constructing a crude web across the ledger's margins. And Seraphina? She watched it all, committing every detail to memory. Her education at Radcliffe had taught her how to build an argument. This was no different. At last Octavia looked up. There's a pattern. Every disbursement aligns with either a political donation or a public event Quincy attended on behalf of the Thayer campaign. Seraphine's lips parted. "So he used my family's estate to fund his rise." "Unlawfully," Octavia confirmed. "And stupidly," Theodore added. "He didn't even bother to stagger the deposits." Seraphina stood, spine tall. "Then it's not a question of if we expose him, only when." The ledger now sat open between them like a confession. And for the first time since that cursed party, Seraphina felt not wronged. She felt ready. The brass nameplate still gleamed above the heavy oak doors. Winthrop and Bell, attorneys of trust since 1832. Seraphina adjusted her gloves and stepped into the hush of old money and older secrets. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon oil and pride. She was met by a clerk in waistcoat and spectacles, who blinked twice upon hearing her name. "Miss Pendleton?" "Of course. Mr. Remington Winthrop will see you in the Franklin room." Theodore, at her side, murmured, "I don't like it." Too eager. But Seraphina pressed forward. The Franklin room was all walnut panels and quiet carpets. Mr. Winthrop himself rose to greet her, a tall, thin man with hands like bird bones and eyes that had forgotten how to be surprised. "Miss Pendleton, we've not had the pleasure since your mother's passing. I'm here about the trust," she said, sitting without invitation, a flicker in his eye, not quite alarm, more calculation. "I've discovered a ledger hidden in my mother's armoire. It lists disbursements from the Pendleton Trust to fictitious vendors, Wellington Press, Langley and Sons, and so forth, all signed or authorized by Quincy Thayer." Winthrop exhaled slowly. "Ah? Ah?" she echoed. "I feared this might come to light." He opened a drawer and removed a thin file. "Your mother had suspicions near the end, but she chose discretion over scandal." Theodore leaned forward. "So you knew?" "Not knew. Suspected. Quincy's access was partial, but cleverly exploited. He diverted funds under legitimate headings, expenses for family events, charitable donations, campaign dinners. We were given forged invoices." "And you said nothing," Serafina said. Winthrop's hands folded. "I advised your mother to revoke his access. She chose to preserve appearances. She feared the damage to your reputation should the engagement sour." A beat of silence. Seraphine's voice, when it came, was very calm. "We are beyond preservation now, Mr. Winthrop." He nodded once. "Then allow me to assist. There are sealed statements, affidavits, signed under fiduciary review documenting irregularities. Your mother required them sealed, but you, as successor, may unseal them." She took the file he offered. Inside, 3 notarized pages, each noting misaligned accounts and irregular withdrawals. Her name freshly inscribed along the edge. "You will provide a certified copy?" she asked. "Of course. And if it comes to trial?" "It won't, but thank you." They left the office without shaking hands. Theodore held the door. "Still think I was too eager?" She asked him. He smiled. "No, just eager enough." Outside, Boston's wind curled through the streets, but Serafina walked straight-backed, the file tucked under her arm like a weapon holstered. Quincy had borrowed power. Now she would reclaim it. The Edevin Gallery was known for 3 things: its obscenely rich patrons, its fondness for obscure Flemish portraiture, and the white wine always served too warm. Serafina arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, alone but not unarmed. The sealed folder from Winthrop and Bell was tucked in her evening satchel, beside her gloves and an untouched invitation. She did not come to bid. She came to be seen. The room buzzed with the genteel friction of pedigree and envy. Brush strokes and bloodlines hung on the walls. Serafina moved like she belonged there, because she did, and made her way to the far corner, where a portrait of an unnamed noblewoman with cold eyes overlooked the scene. She'd just begun her second circuit when she saw him. Quincy Thayer wearing confidence like cologne, dark suit, red carnation, a cut too precise to be spontaneous. He was not here for art. He was here for something far less valuable: reassurance. Their eyes met across a canvas of St. Sebastian. "Miss Pendleton," he said, approaching, looking radiant as ever. She inclined her head. "Mr. Thayer, a pleasure I hadn't anticipated. I find surprises invigorating, some more than others." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Word travels. You've been quite industrious." "As have you. The letters you never meant me to see were particularly enlightening." He blinked. What letters? She tapped her satchel. The ones bearing your signature. The ones describing me as hysterical, potentially delusional, and what was it? A liability to public ambition. His jaw tightened. You stole them. I received them. Voluntarily. Your allies are thinner than you recall. His voice dropped. You're bluffing. Try me. A woman near them turned, pretending to admire a still life, though her ear tilted toward them. Serafina noticed. So did Quincy. You've always been dramatic, he said softly, and you've always mistaken calculation for cruelty. There is a difference. He glanced at the woman, then back to Serafina. If you go public, I won't, she interrupted. Not if you vanish quietly. No campaigns, no slander, no further theft. He studied her. And if I refuse? She leaned in. Then I release everything. You'll not only lose the donors, you'll lose the name. And in our world, Quincy, reputation is inheritance. A pause, then a slow, venomous smile. Touché, Serafina. She turned before he could speak again. As she moved away, the woman near them whispered to her companion, That was the Pendleton girl, wasn't it? The one who nearly married Thayer. Nearly Serafina did not look back. It was late afternoon when the note arrived, folded with the neatness of a woman who knew how secrets traveled. The paper bore no seal, but the signature was unmistakable. Sybil Rourke. Serafina stared at the name. Not since the engagement party had they spoken, when Sybil toasted Quincy in front of 50 Bostonian elites and called him a paragon of public character. Now the same woman requested tea, alone, urgently. She instructed Mrs. Dawlish to receive no other callers and sent a reply with a single word, come. By 5 o'clock, Sybil sat across from her in the drawing-room, clad in a dove-gray traveling coat and gloves that looked barely worn. Her face was unreadable, but not unconcerned. I owe you an apology, Sybil said without ceremony. Serafina tilted her head. For calling me volatile at the Thayer brunch? Or for inviting me to a dinner knowing Quincy would sit beside his mistress? Sybil flinched. Both and more. She opened her handbag and drew out a small folio of cream-colored stationery. Letters from Quincy to Nathaniel Price, and one to my brother. I thought they were simple campaign communications until I read closer. Seraphine's expression didn't change, but her pulse quickened. Sybil continued. He asked them to obstruct your access to Foundation funds. He claimed you were becoming unfit to represent the Pendleton name and proposed reassigning your board seats to him and a more manageable spouse. Maria? Serafina asked. Or whomever would follow. The letters are arrogant. Worse, unwise. He expected loyalty, not prudence. And now? I don't give loyalty to thieves, Sybil said simply. Serafina accepted the folio. Thank you. Sybil stood. Use them wisely. The elite forget. They are watched even by their own. She left with a rustle of skirts and the faint scent of lilacs. When the door shut, Serafina placed the letters beside the file from Winthrop and Bell. The pile grew thicker. So did her resolve. The fire crackled low in the drawing-room hearth, casting long shadows across the parquet floor. Serafina stood by the window, staring into the twilight where lamps began to flicker awake on Commonwealth Avenue. Behind her, Theodore closed the door with unusual care. You knew, she said. He didn't answer right away, only moved to the decanter and poured a glass of sherry. I suspected, then I confirmed. That's not quite the same as knowing. When? Her voice was sharp as the edge of the tongs resting by the hearth. "About a year ago," he admitted, "I overheard Quincy at the Somerset Club. He was speaking too freely after too much port. Something about leveraging the Pendleton Trust and putting Serafina back in the box where she belonged." Her fingers curled against the silk drapery. "You didn't tell me." "I had no proof. And I hoped you'd leave him before it came to this." "And if I hadn't?" she asked. "Then I would have done something foolish, public, something that would have made this harder for you." She turned. "And now?" "Now I see that you don't need protection. You need partnership. But I can't give that while you still weigh your life against Quincy's ghost." Serafina crossed the room slowly. "You think I mourn him?" Theodore set the sherry down untouched. "I think you mourn the future you planned, and that unless you let go of that blueprint, you'll never see the new one waiting." "And you?" she asked softly. "I'm here. I always have been. But I won't linger in the wings forever." She studied him, the man who had steadied her when she swayed, who never asked for credit, but always offered clarity. "I'm not ready," she said, "but I'm closer." He smiled, not with triumph, but with understanding. "That's all I ask." She reached for his hand. He took it, and for the first time in weeks the room felt warmer. The invitation arrived by morning post, engraved on thick cardstock and scented with violets. The return address read, "Miss Honoria Talbot, Chestnut Hill, Providence." Serafina turned the card in her hand. The contents were brief but unmistakable. Miss Talbot was hosting a private salon for women of means and vision, and she wished Serafina to speak on inheritance law, political influence, and civic duty. Theodore read it over her shoulder. "This is no ordinary gathering." "No," Serafina said, tapping the embossed monogram. "It's a proving ground." The Talbot salons were legendary quiet crucibles where legislation had been shaped, social campaigns launched, and alliances forged between women who had no official vote, but wielded power all the same. "She wants to see if I'll sink or swim." "Then go," Theodore said. "Swim." Serafina sent her reply by courier and spent the day preparing notes on inheritance statutes, a précis on the Pendleton Trust, and a soft dove-gray gown with understated pearls. When she arrived at the Talbot estate, the drawing room held 12 women judges' wives, merchant heiresses, 2 former suffragists. None spoke until Honoria Talbot raised her hand. "Miss Pendleton," she said, "the floor is yours." Serafina began. Her voice was steady, her facts clear. She spoke not of scandal, but of structure, how trusts can be misused, how women can guard their holdings, how silence preserves theft. She quoted her mother, nodded to her grandmother's textile legacy, and ended with a simple line, "We must build scaffolds, not just statues." When she finished, there was silence. Then applause. Honoria rose. "You'll be hearing from us again?" As Serafina stepped out into the dusk, Theodore was waiting by the motor car. "How was the arena?" he asked. She smiled. "I believe I made my entrance." The file from Winthrop and Bell, the letters from Sybil, the notes from Providence. They lay fanned across her writing desk like pieces in a game only she could finish. Serafina studied them with quiet intensity. The dawn outside was pale and unflattering, a canvas without illusion. She had enough to ruin Quincy legally, socially, financially. But what did she want? Vindication or transformation? The door creaked. Theodore stepped in, already dressed, holding 2 steaming cups. "You haven't slept," he said. "I didn't want to decide this tired," she replied. He handed her a cup and stood beside her. Together they looked down at the paper trail. "If you publish it," he said slowly, "you'll bring the house down. But the house might land on you, too." Serafina took a sip. "Or I can use it to restructure the trust. Remove Quincy quietly, appoint independent oversight, shift the family's influence where it's earned, not inherited. The quieter path, the more strategic one." He nodded. "So what will you do?" She placed the cup down and turned to him. "Both. Quiet power with loud results. The papers won't name him, but the reforms will leave no room for a man like him to ever return." Theodore looked at her with something more than approval. "Then it begins." "Yes." He reached for her hand. "Serafina Pendleton, may I kiss you now?" She smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." Their lips met not as consolation, but as confirmation. Outside, the first bird of morning sang. Inside, the game had changed. The boardroom on the 12th floor of the Pendleton Trust headquarters was as grim as she remembered it, mahogany-paneled, darkly varnished, oppressively silent. At one end of the table sat Serafina Pendleton, flanked by folders and annotated ledgers. Opposite her sat 6 men, most of whom still used wax seals on their correspondence. She tapped her notes once, then began. "Gentlemen, the structure of this trust was crafted in another century. The world has changed, and we must change with it." Murmurs, raised brows. One man, Mr. Harriman, Quincy's longtime advocate, sighed audibly. Serafina outlined her proposed reforms: removal of lifetime appointments, mandatory third-party audits, a revised investment strategy to support civic projects. She spoke calmly, firmly, never blinking. Harriman leaned forward. "And what authority do you claim to propose this?" She slid a document across the table, a letter of directive signed by the last chairwoman, her grandmother, granting Serafina interim powers upon evidence of gross misconduct. She had that evidence. Winthrop and Bell had certified it. Silence. Then Mr. Ludlow, who once called her a charming ornament at age 16, cleared his throat. "She has the mandate," he said, "and the clarity our board sorely lacks." Serafina kept her expression neutral. "Thank you." Votes were cast. 4 in favor, 2 opposed. The motion passed. As the meeting ended, one board member lingered behind. Mr. Radley, whose son had nearly drowned in a mill accident funded by Quincy's diverted capital. He placed a firm hand on Serafina's shoulder. "You're doing what none of us dared," he said. "May Providence favor you." Serafina nodded. This was only the first room, but the door had opened. The Boston Herald ran the headline in bold, Gothic font: "Eros seeks power, shuns tradition." Below it, a smiling photo of Quincy Rollins, arms crossed, appeared over a column heavy with insinuation. Words like volatile, rash, and estranged from tradition sprang off the page. Serafina sat in the morning room, the paper spread before her, fingers smudged with ink. Across from her, Theodore grimaced as he read the opening paragraph aloud. "In what some are calling an opportunistic power grab, Miss Serafina Pendleton has begun restructuring her family's historic trust, ... single." Quotes, he set it down. "It's a character assassination." "Precision work," she muttered, folding the paper. "Quincy style." A whisper campaign followed. At the Athenaeum, matrons with feathered hats spoke in hushed tones. At fundraisers, eyes flitted over her like she was a precarious sculpture. One woman even asked, "Is it true your nerves have been delicate since childhood?" It wasn't the gossip that stung, it was how easily people accepted a man's version of her sanity over her work. Yet the storm was not without breaks. Letters arrived, anonymous ones of thanks, an unsigned bouquet of violets with a card, "For Courage Boston remembers." And then Sybil's note, short and sharply written. "You expected a counterattack. I say, let him draw attention. Now they're watching. Show them something worth watching." Serafina burned the newspaper, but not the letter. Quincy wanted a war of image. She would give him substance. The grand ballroom of the Union Club shimmered with gold light and the low clink of cutlery on fine porcelain. A charity dinner for the Boston Widows and Children's Society, the event drew the elite like moth to a gaslight flame. Serafina stood just inside the double doors, hands clasped in front of her. Her gown was pale indigo, her mother's sapphire pin at the collar. Beside her, Theodore adjusted his cuffs, then leaned down. "You can still walk out," he murmured. "Then he wins," she said. As they entered, conversation dimmed. People turned. Some nodded politely, others feigned blindness. But Serafina walked with purpose to the front table, where a seat bore her name beside the event chairwoman's. The night unfurled in courses and performances, a children's choir, a sentimental reading by a society novelist. Then, just before dessert, the chairwoman introduced Serafina to speak. As she approached the lectern, someone muttered, "Let's see how fragile she really is." She smiled. "My name is Serafina Pendleton," she began. "I speak tonight not only as a patron, but as someone intimately familiar with loss of control, of narrative, of legacy, and I stand before you not undone by it, but shaped." Gasps, a stir of attention. "I inherited more than a trust. I inherited responsibility, not to tradition, but to truth." She paused. "Tonight's cause reminds us that widows and children are too often rendered invisible. Let us ensure they are never silenced." Applause measured, then swelling. Theodore stood first, then others followed. Serafina returned to her seat. The woman beside her whispered, "That was beautifully inconvenient." Serafina smiled. "That would do." Sybil Rourke arrived just past 10 with a thick folder under one arm and a flask-shaped reticule glinting in the sunlight. "I don't bring gifts lightly," she said, settling in Seraphine's study, "but this one is overdue." Inside the folder, a sealed envelope. Familiar. The wax bore the crest of her mother's personal stationery. "I found it tucked in an old volume of Brockton's Inheritance Law," Sybil explained. "Misfiled or hidden, depending how romantic you're feeling today." Serafina broke the seal with careful fingers. The parchment inside smelled faintly of lavender and ink. "Dearest Sarah, if you find this, then I am gone. But I know you, my fierce girl. You will be searching, not for comfort, but for clarity. Let me tell you what I could not when breath still filled me. Quincy was not chosen for his wisdom. He was chosen because I believed you would never forgive yourself for rising too early. That was my failure, not yours. Take what you must, protect what you can, but do not ask permission to shape the legacy that bears your name." Seraphine's hand trembled. Theodore entered silently and laid a hand on her shoulder. "She knew," Serafina whispered. "All of it, she knew." The letter closed with her mother's initials and a pressed violet, a symbol between them since childhood. The past had not betrayed her. It had waited, and now it was hers. The courtroom of the Pendleton Trust Review Board was never meant for dramatics. Wood-paneled walls, brass sconces, and a ceiling fan that groaned with the slow swing of time. But that morning the air buzzed with tension, and it had nothing to do with the heat. Sybil Rourke stepped forward, gloved hands steady, chin lifted. Her presence was that of a woman who had walked out of scandal and back into her own name. "I come not to wound but to cleanse," she said. Serafina watched from the rear bench, Theodore beside her, the seat between them symbolically empty. It had once belonged to Quincy. Sybil handed the chairman a packet of letters, each one damning, cross-referenced, dated, written in Quincy's own hand or that of his proxies. "Miss Rourke," the chairman asked, "are you asserting these were written during Mr. Pendleton's active tenure as executor?" "I am. I have the receipts, the ledgers, and the signature verifications to match." The board shuffled papers. The hum of whispering members was punctuated by one voice, an elderly trustee known for his silence. "It's all here," he murmured. "Quincy used the trust like a private vault." Seraphine's breath stilled. She had seen the pieces, but now they snapped into place like clockwork. Sybil had been waiting, documenting, preparing, and now she delivered. One board member asked if the motive was vengeance. "I am a Pendleton by scandal, not birth," Sybil said coolly. "I owe the family nothing. But Serafina, she gave me a second reputation. This testimony is my return." By noon, the chairman declared the board would reconvene the following week to review formal charges against Quincy Pendleton. A motion was passed Sybil's evidence would be sealed until then to avoid preemptive legal interference. Serafina stood, her hand brushing Sybil's as they passed in the hallway. "You saved me a year's war," she said quietly. Sybil tilted her head. "That's what sisters in scandal are for." The chamber felt colder than usual, though the fireplace glowed dutifully. Every man in the room wore a look of polite dread except Theodore. He stood as the chairman called the session to order, his palm resting on the back of the chair he had once claimed as Quincy's proxy. "I will not waste your time," he said. "This will be brief. What I am about to declare is not for leverage, nor for politics. It is for clarity." A few leaned forward. A few leaned back. "I hereby withdraw my support of Quincy Pendleton's governance of this trust," Theodore said plainly. "And I declare, without condition, my support for Miss Serafina Talbot to assume full stewardship." Gasps quiet, but audible. Someone dropped a pen. "Mr. Ransom," a trustee challenged. "Your family's holdings are entwined." "I've untwined them," Theodore replied. 3 weeks ago. I sold every Pendleton-bound holding. You'll find the paperwork has already been submitted. And what of your reputation?" Another barked. Theodore's smile held no fear. "I would rather be known as a man who corrected course than one who defended a sinking ship out of pride." Silence followed. The old guard blinked, unprepared for such blunt courage. Then a slow nod from a trustee in the back row, a signal that Theodore had cracked the facade. When the session adjourned, Serafina was waiting in the hallway, her gloved hands clasped, breath shallow. "You didn't tell me you'd do it today," she murmured. I needed to say it while the ceiling still held. She touched his lapel, voice trembling. "You didn't have to choose me." "I didn't," he said. "I chose truth." It just happened to wear your name. The arbitration chamber echoed with a stillness unnatural for its grand size. Quincy Pendleton sat stiffly at one end, his suit pressed, but his eyes tired, red-rimmed, unblinking. Across from him, Seraphina wore navy silk and resolve. She had not spoken yet. She did not need to. A judge of neutral appointment opened the hearing. Mr. Pendleton, the board has leveled 12 charges. Embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, coercive restructuring. Lies, Quincy spat, loud enough to draw a frown from the judge. Manufactured by a bitter woman. Seraphina did not flinch. She watched him as one watches a fire already choked of oxygen. "Mr. Pendleton," the judge warned, "you'll have your opportunity to speak." What followed was a parade of affidavits. Sybil's testimony. Financial discrepancies dating back 6 years. Letters and ledgers unearthed from Quincy's private safe. Then the real blow. Archibald Tate, Quincy's longtime ally and apologist, rose from the observer's bench and requested to speak. "I was wrong," Tate said, gaze lowered. "I covered for Quincy. I signed transfers I never read. I prioritized loyalty over integrity. I offer my resignation ... and this." He handed over a folder one containing notarized documents detailing Quincy's manipulation of donor funds. Quincy's composure cracked. "Archie, you spineless toad. Silence," the judge ordered. A pause, then, "This chamber finds sufficient evidence to recommend formal criminal proceedings against Quincy Pendleton." Quincy stood slowly. His hands trembled. "This is a coup, not justice," Seraphina finally spoke. "No, Quincy. This is your own ledger catching up." As he was escorted out by officers, his eyes darted to Theodore, who looked away. The new headquarters of the Pendleton Benevolence Initiative smelled of fresh plaster and cedar oil. The windows stretched 2 stories, and the brass plaque outside bore a simple inscription, "For those we owe." Seraphina moved slowly through the grand corridor, fingers grazing the etched names on the donor wall. Beside her, Theodore offered a crooked grin. "You built this from smoke and ash," he said. She smiled faintly. "No, I just removed the men who kept locking the doors." They stopped in the nursery wing, a sun-drenched suite with shelves for books not yet written. "This was your idea," Seraphina said. "I didn't think you'd say yes." "I didn't think I'd say yes to any of it," she said. Then the world turned upside down, and there you were, still standing, still mine. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small silver rattle, engraved with the initials S.T.R. Seraphina Talbot Ransom. Her breath hitched. "You knew?" He nodded. "Weeks ago. But I waited for you to tell me." She placed his hand over her abdomen. "It's 2, she whispered. He blinked. "Twins?" She nodded. "2 futures, Theodore. One life I chose. One that chose me." They stood there, amid sunlight and sawdust, beneath a legacy neither had imagined. "I hope they both have your fire," he murmured. "I hope they never need it," she replied. Then, quietly, she added, "But if they do, I'll be ready." The judge's chambers were unadorned, no portrait, no gavel, just dust-heavy shelves and the ticking of an old ship's chronometer on the mantel. The formal sentencing had taken less than an hour. Quincy Pendleton, stripped of his stewardship and indicted on 6 counts of financial fraud and conspiracy, was sentenced to a minimum of 9 years in state prison. The room, filled with spectators, exhaled in quiet finality. Seraphina sat straight-backed, her gloves immaculate. She did not smile. Theodore touched her arm lightly as the courtroom emptied. You won. She turned to him. I didn't come for a win. I came for a reckoning. Justice is simply its shadow. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered like gulls. Flashbulbs sparked. A clerk approached her with a prepared statement. You've the right to issue a press comment, he offered. Serafina looked at the parchment, then handed it back. No, she said. Let the silence speak louder. As they walked down the courthouse steps, a voice from the crowd cried, Miss Talbot, do you forgive him? Serafina paused, looked directly at the questioner. No, she said, but I no longer need to. Theodore opened the carriage door. She stepped in, head high. The city's wind carried whispers, but Serafina heard only the ticking of that courtroom chronometer. Time moved forward. So would she. The garden terrace at Fenway House was in bloom, the early summer air sweet with lilac and lavender. A long table stretched beneath a linen canopy, set with painted china and a silver samovar. Barbara had insisted on the shower. For once, she'd said, let's celebrate a beginning, not a reckoning. Sybil played hostess with flair, moving like a diplomat among the guest society ladies, reformers and Seraphine's most loyal allies. Serafina sat at the table's center, radiant but composed. Her dress was pale sage, her hair pulled back in a crown of braids. Her hand rested on the curve of her abdomen. The twins stirred beneath the silk. Toasts were made. There were no party games. Barbara gave a speech, impromptu but poignant, to Serafina Talbot Ransom, who taught us that rebuilding isn't weakness, it's power. Applause rippled, heartfelt and intimate. As guests began to wander the garden paths, Serafina took a quiet turn near the rose trellises. There, of all people, stood Maria. Their eyes met, not hostile, uncertain. Maria stepped forward, hands clasped. I wasn't sure I should come. I wasn't sure you would, Serafina replied. I owed you an apology, for everything. Serafina said nothing, waiting. Maria looked down. I believed Quincy's stories, that you were ruthless, cold. He made betrayal seem like liberation. And now? Maria met her gaze. Now I know he was the cold one. I'm sorry for helping him wound you. Serafina considered this. He wounded me, but you didn't create the blade. They stood in silence, two women linked by betrayal, now gently unwinding from it. Will you stay for tea? Serafina asked at last. Maria blinked. You'd have me? I would, she said. Today is for grace. Maria nodded, her voice small. Thank you. They walked back toward the canopy, not as friends, but no longer adversaries. In the center of the table, beneath the glass dome, sat a single slice of cake, a raspberry tear made by Serafina herself. For the next generation, the card read, and for the first time in months, Serafina laughed. The thunder rolled in just past midnight. Boston sky cracked with light, rain lashing against the windows of the Talbot townhome. Serafina stood in the hallway, her hands braced against the banister, breath short. Theo, she called, her voice tight with pain. He was there in seconds. One look at her face and he understood. The contractions? She nodded. They've started and they're close. No carriage at that hour. He called for the automobile, rattling old but faithful. Rain soaked them both as he guided her into the passenger seat. He gripped the wheel like a lifeline as lightning lit the cobbled streets. At Massachusetts General, nurses swarmed them. Serafina, half soaked, was ushered into the maternity wing. The contractions hit harder now, each one slicing breath and thought. Her hand found Theodore's. Hours passed in a blur linen sheets, shouted instructions, the hiss of gas. The doctor's face tightened during a check. One is breech. We may need to operate. No, Serafina gasped. No knives unless... We'll do everything, he said. But if either child is in distress... She nodded once, fiercely. Theodore never left her side. You're stronger than any storm, he whispered. She gripped his hand until he winced. I know, she said. Now shut up and count. She pushed. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one within. And then a cry. A girl. Strong lungs, fierce spirit. Miss Talbot, the doctor said, your daughter's here. But Serafini barely heard. The second twin was not yet born. The room tensed again. Come on, she whispered. You're not leaving her alone. And minutes later, a second cry, this one hoarser, slower. A boy, the nurse said. Small, but he's breathing. Serafina collapsed back, tears cutting tracks through sweat. Theodore kissed her temple. You did it. She closed her eyes. We did. The nursery glowed in the gentle morning light. Pale wallpaper, soft green with hand-painted birds in flight. 2 bassinets side by side, like little arks. Serafina sat in a rocking chair, her daughter swaddled in one arm, her son in the other. Their eyes fluttered beneath soft lids. She exhaled, bone deep. Barbara tiptoed in with tea. You've done the impossible, darling. Serafina smiled. Twice over? Names yet? She looked down at the tiny faces. Her name is Rosamond, and he Theodore, after his father. Barbara nodded, misty. They sound like a legacy. As she left, Theodore entered quietly, holding a small box. I thought, he said, we might make something official. He knelt. Opened the box, a simple ring platinum, antique. Serafina stared. You're serious? More than I've ever been? I don't want to just build a life with you. I want to build the life. She looked from him to the children. I accept, she whispered. And in the stillness of the nursery, where love had grown fierce and quiet, Theodore kissed her hand. Outside, Boston moved forward. Inside, the Talbots knew, remade began again. The morning was gray, with fog rising off the harbor, curling over cobblestone streets like whispered secrets. Serafina sat at the breakfast table, a letter spread out before her, its embossed seal glinting faintly in the light. Across from her, Theodore balanced Rosamond on one knee and a teacup in the other. You're awfully quiet. She passed him the letter. From New York. They want me to helm the new Whitby collection. It's considerable. Salary, resources, influence, a fresh start. Theodore scanned it, whistling low. That's not an offer. That's a coronation. She sipped her tea. I don't know if I want to be crowned again. He studied her carefully. You've built something here. But you always said Boston was your proving ground, not your resting place. I did, she admitted. And yet the thought of packing up this life, the nursery, Barbara, Sybil, our friends, ... He looked around their home, now warm with small messes. Teething rings on the mantel, sketches tacked to the piano. Places don't hold us, Serafina. People do. And wherever we go, we take this. She smiled softly. We'd have to move within the month. Then we'd better start making lists. Their son babbled at that, slapping Theodore's arm with enthusiastic approval. They laughed, caught in that rare, luminous hush where everything felt both immense and perfectly right. Serafina reached for Theodore's hand. Let's write the next chapter ourselves. Together, he said. Outside, the fog lifted. Boston's skyline loomed faintly through the clearing mist, a city that had broken and remade her. And now, perhaps, it was time to leave. The nursery floor was scattered with toys, wooden blocks, stuffed animals, and the ever-elusive cloth book Theodore swore had been enchanted to disappear nightly. Afternoon sun fell warm through the lace curtains, painting golden patches on the rug. Serafina knelt on the floor, coaxing Rosamond upright with outstretched arms. "Come to Mama," she whispered. Behind her, Theodore leaned against the doorframe with a proud grin, their son balanced on his hip. "She's almost there?" With a determined wobble, Rosamond lifted her foot and took 1, 2, 3 miraculous steps into Seraphine's embrace. Laughter burst from them both, loud, incredulous, overjoyed. Not to be outdone, their son squirmed until Theodore set him down. He toddled forward, legs bowing, toppling into Seraphine's lap just as Rosamond began clapping gleefully. "They did it," Theodore said, walking over. He dropped to his knees beside her, drawing both children into a family heap. "They really did." Serafina held them tightly, her chin resting atop Rosamond's head. "We all did." She looked around the room at the crib Theodore had built, the sketches she'd framed, the wall where they'd marked each month in penciled heights. It was a history carved in wood and breath. "This house was our shelter," she said softly. "But I'm ready." Theodore didn't need clarification. "New York?" she nodded. "Let's go. Before we start inventing reasons not to." The twins wriggled in their arms, demanding applause, attention, snacks all at once. "First steps," Theodore murmured. In more ways than one. They kissed their children, then each other, sealing the decision with quiet joy. The townhouse buzzed with quiet celebration. Candles flickered from brass sconces, casting a honeyed glow on the familiar walls that had once absorbed heartbreak, laughter, and lullabies. Serafina moved among her guests, balancing a tray of petit fours while dodging curious twins who had recently discovered crawling at speed. Barbara plucked one off the floor mid-sprint and handed him to Theodore with a smirk. "Your son has your ambition and none of your restraint." Aaron lifted a glass. "To Boston's loss and New York's gain." "To Serafina," Barbara added, "who never did anything halfway." Laughter, clinks of crystal, the quiet ache of goodbyes. In the corner, Sybil Rourke offered Serafina a slender envelope. "It's not a goodbye letter. Just a reminder that you change more than your own life here." "Thank you, Sybil." They embraced tightly, the kind shared by women who had once seen one another shattered. Later that night, after the guests had gone, Theodore and Barbara lingered in the parlor, old records spinning low. They toasted once more, this time in quiet. "To surviving it all," Theodore murmured. "To what comes next," Barbara answered, eyes damp. A knock interrupted them. On the doorstep lay a small parcel addressed in Maria's hand. Inside, a silver locket engraved with the initials of both twins and a note. "Forgiveness isn't owed, but I offer it anyway. Wishing you peace." Serafina pressed the locket to her heart. Peace accepted. The train hissed as it pulled away from the station, its polished brass fittings gleaming in the mid-morning sun. Serafina sat by the window, Zoe nestled in her arms, while Theodore helped settle their belongings into the upholstered compartment. The twins, now in matching traveling coats, peeked from the velvet bench seat, enthralled by the blur of platform and sky. Everything aboard? Serafina asked. Everything that matters, Theodore replied, sitting beside her. She watched Boston shrink behind them, landmarks dissolving into motion. Do you think they'll remember this city? No, he said softly, but they'll remember us, what we gave them here. She opened a new leather-bound journal from her satchel, its pages crisp and unsullied. On the first page, she wrote the date in one line. This is how we begin again. Outside the window, the horizon opened, a ribbon of steel and light carrying them onward. 10 years had passed since the Rourke family left Boston's cobbled charm for New York's relentless pulse. The years had not softened the edges of the city, but Serafina had learned how to move with its rhythm rather than against it. It was a different world from the parlor-room dramas and whispered scandals of the Back Bay, a world of skylines and subways, of museum galas and working lunches, of chaos and clarity, both in equal measure. Their townhouse on the Upper West Side was narrower than their Boston home, but taller, filled with the kind of chaotic joy only children could create. Rosamond, now a precocious 10, was orchestrating a backyard play starring herself, her twin brother, and 2 begrudging cats in hats. She wielded a baton fashioned from a curtain rod and directed with all the severity of a Broadway conductor. Meanwhile, Theodore Jr. Teddy, to all who knew him, was buried in his telescope, furiously sketching moon maps and occasionally correcting his sister's dramatic liberties. Their bond was fierce, the kind that produced thunderous arguments and fierce loyalty in the same breath. Theodore, still sporting spectacles perched forever on his nose, and now managing editor at a prominent publishing house, stepped into the garden with 2 iced lemonades in hand. He passed one to Serafina, who was lounging on a blanket with her newest journal balanced across her knees. They've renamed the 3rd cat Bartholomew, he said. Again. Serafina sipped her lemonade. That's the 4th Bartholomew this month. I assume this one's a pirate? An abolitionist spy in disguise, according to Rosamond. Even better. She leaned back and let the sun warm her face, trying not to feel the hours she'd spent at the museum that week. The Whitby collection had flourished under her curatorship, becoming a flagship for historical storytelling that merged artistry and truth. Her name was now regularly cited in lecture halls and symposiums, but it was days like this, blanket days, lemonade days, laughter in the garden days, that she treasured most. I had a letter from Barbara, Theodore said, pulling a creased envelope from his jacket. She and Aaron are finally visiting next month. She's bringing that lemon pound cake recipe you love. Serafina smiled. I might cry if she doesn't. It's the only version that doesn't come out like sweetened granite. He folded the letter again, more slowly this time. She said Sybil's engaged, a widow with 3 boys and a shipping business in Salem. Sybil Rourke, matron of maritime chaos. Apparently the engagement was announced on a lobster trawler. She laughed, then head thrown back, the kind of laugh that made people turn their heads at cafe tables. Theodore watched her for a moment, quiet, as if engraving her joy in his memory. You know, she said eventually, I used to think everything important would happen by 30. He raised an eyebrow. You're telling me my finest moment wasn't that time I fixed the boiler at 3 a.m.? No, that was heroism. But real life, it's this. A blanket in the sun, cats in hats, lemonade. They fell into companionable silence until a small voice piped up. Mother, do we have any red ribbon for the prisoner's disguise? Rosamond was back, cheeks flushed, one cat tucked under her arm like an unwilling sidekick. "Top drawer in the hall dresser," Serafina replied. "Next to the string and the emergency chocolate." Rosamond dashed off. "She's you," Theodore said. "Entirely. And Teddy?" He chuckled. "A quieter me, with better math." A breeze stirred the trees. Serafina closed her journal, placing it gently in the crook of her elbow. "I'm glad we left. I'm glad we didn't stay comfortable." "I think we never were," he said. "Comfortable is a suit that doesn't quite fit. We chose joy instead. It's harder to tailor, but it wears better." From the house came the sound of a door slamming, followed by the furious barking of the family dog and Rosamond's triumphant shriek. "We may need to upgrade the emergency chocolate," Serafina muttered. "Agreed." As the sun dipped low and the garden filled with fireflies, she and Theodore sat together beneath the stars, listening to the distant sounds of childhood voices building new stories. Later that night, with the twins asleep and the house quiet save for the city beyond their window, Serafina opened her journal again. She penned only a single line. "Inheritance is not always gold and land. Sometimes it is survival. Sometimes it is joy." And beneath that she wrote the names of her children, not because she feared forgetting, but because she wanted the record to begin here with a woman who had rebuilt her life one tender page at a time. And so, dear friends, our tale draws to a close. If you've lingered until the final word, allow me to offer my sincerest thanks. It has been a gentle privilege to share this quiet hour with you. I hope the story brought with it a touch of calm, a soft pause, a thoughtful breath, perhaps the faintest trace of a smile. Until our paths cross once more, be it beside the fire or through a pair of headphones, I wish you peace, comfort, and good company. Another novel shall follow in its time, another evening, another whisper of a world not quite our own. Good night or good day, whichever finds you first.